Hey everyone, this is the fourth edition of God of the Gaps series today. And today, for probably the fourth or the fifth time, I'm going to be very pleased to be speaking quite shortly with the fantastic Dan Barker. Dan has written recently a book called Mere Morality, and it happens to be the very subject that we're going to be addressing today. So this is very good time for us to have this conversation. I would like to welcome Dan Barker into the studio. Hello, Dan. How are you?
Hello, Hanney. Just doing great. Oh, I love that green you've got on there. It
Well,
isn't easy being green, as Kermit said.
it's a bit of an Irish theme going on, so that's
Ah,
the other part of me. So I'm very happy with the brand new studio of instead of the boring green screen with the fake backgrounds. I want to be in where I feel comfortable, just like yourself. So I thought I'll change the background for a change.
so an Egyptian Australian with an Irish theme. There you go.
Yes, indeed,
Huh.
indeed. Well, today, just a little bit of a background for those who are sort of been watching the series from the very beginning, and the natural progression of the fourth step, or the fourth gap of the sources of morality. Basically, the idea has evolved, Dan, when I first got involved in a new application called Clubhouse. Clubhouse is a new application where it's almost like the old Pal Talk, where people can discuss things. And I've realized the amount of atheists and agnostics in the Middle East. It was completely astounding. I thought we were minorities, but the amount of rooms that were open to discuss biology, astronomy, physics, the possibility of the existence of God, and the pushback from the faithful community, obviously starting to open their own rooms, trying to appeal to science, because the flying winged mule of Muhammad and all these fantastical 1001 Night stories are no longer cutting it with the modern generations. They want science. So they all start talking to you about gaps in science, gaps in our knowledge, where supposedly the God, their version of a God, lies within. And we know that this gap's getting closer and closer, smaller and smaller and smaller. And there seem to be 5 questions so far that I've counted that maybe there are no answers, but the premise of, you don't have an answer, and therefore God. We've started from the very beginning, which is the beginning of the universe, cosmological gap, what happened before the Big Bang, and the fine-tuning issue with Professor Lawrence Krauss. Followed by, after the emergence of the universe, then we have life emerging, so biogenesis and first cell, and we had a biology professor talking about that subject. And the third, obviously, after living conscious being, you've got consciousness and that qualia and the subjective experience, and where does it come from? Is it so mysterious? We know from Dan Dennett it's not really that complex, and we don't have to make a big hoo-ha about it. And so is morality. Now, after life has emerged and we have conscious beings within it, they've got to interact with each other. And this is where I think where morality comes into play. So if you can tell us a little bit about what do you think morality is, Dan?
Okay, but first of all, you're right about the God of the Gaps. When I do my debates, I've done more than 130 public debates. Those are the issues they bring up. How do you explain this? Oh, you can't explain it. Therefore God. But that doesn't do anything. They still have to make a case for their explanation, even if it's true. Even if science has no answers to anything of these questions, they just can't plug in what they want. They have to make a case for their explanation. But yeah, morality comes up a lot during the debates. Where's the source of absolute morality, people will say. And if there's no God, there's no reason for right or wrong. And even atheists, they will say, even we atheists agree with morality. Therefore, we must be agreeing that there is some absolute standard outside of ourselves, which is a realm that they could call God. You hear all these arguments a lot. So the book that you mentioned that I wrote is called Mere Morality. I have a copy here. Mere Morality. And I think some of your viewers will understand that title because of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, the Christian Anglican theologian, he was a lay theologian. He wrote a book called Mere Christianity. And in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis was trying to say, we've got this huge onion of Christianity and all these faiths and denominations. Can we strip away what's non-essential until we get down to the core of what it actually means to be a Christian, a mere Christian? There's more to it than that, of course, but what's the mere core? So I'm doing the same thing in this book, Mere Morality. There's all this talk about how to be moral, how to be ethical, what's good, all these dilemmas, but basically what is the core? So I don't think charity and compassion and sacrifice is necessary to be a moral person. I think that's the out part of the onion. In fact, if it were required to be charitable and sacrificial and giving, then it wouldn't be praiseworthy. When people do things that are like, when they really help, and a lot of atheists do too, when they give to the poor, when they try to fight inequality or, work for a good cause, we applaud that precisely because we know they don't have to do that. So what my book is asking is, those things are great and we need it for a good world, but what is the core? What is the basic minimum? I think you can be a moral person without being charitable or without even being kind or without even being sacrificial. I think morality at its core is just the simple concept of acting with the intention of minimizing harm. And that's the real word there. If we're talking about moral actions, how do we treat other people? Aren't we just talking about harm? How do we judge whether a religion is better than another? If it causes more harm or less harm? How do we judge if a person is better than another? If their lives are intending to cause less harm or more harm? When you look at a psychopath and you see their actions, they're increasing harm. When you look at some criminals, they're increasing harm. And so in Mere Morality, I make a case that for the basic core of what it means to be good, if you are an individual who's intending to act to minimize harm, then you are by definition a moral person, even if you fail, because sometimes we don't know everything, right? But as long as that's your intention, and if you look at the law considers intention to be just as important as the actual act. So that's how I define mere morality, with the caveat, of course, that there's much more to a richer moral life than that. But I want to look at what is the simple core.
And that's what I loved about the book, because it gives you that the minimal expectations or the minimal level that you need to reach to be a moral person, and it makes it nice and easy. Because sometimes people look at morality and I think this is a mountain to climb. You got to do so much to be a good person. But I like the way that you said, no, you don't really have to. All what you have to do is avoid inflicting harm on others, and if you can start with just that, you're already a moral person. You can indeed build upon that and get better at it, and that's the outer layer of the onion, or if you wish, to get better at it and do even more extreme stuff. But the minimum thing you can do is to avoid inflicting harm on others, and that is a very good start, and it's a very simple one.
Okay,
However,
but the way you just phrased it is just a little bit off. We can't always avoid inflicting harm. Sometimes you need to cause harm. You notice on the cover of the book, there's this compass.
yes.
So I think mere morality is a compass. A compass doesn't tell you where to go. What does a compass do? It just tells you where you are. It points where north is. And I think if we can use this analogy, if it holds up, north, if we define north as the intention of minimizing harm, if you're heading north, but sometimes the terrain is complicated and you have a compass and it says there's north, but sometimes to get north, you sometimes have to go east or west for a while. And sometimes you even have to go south for a while. But your intention is to end up going more north. So instead of thinking that we have to avoid all harm, what I think what the intention is that we minimize we have as less harm as possible. For example, we all know it's a bad thing to cut off somebody's arm or somebody's leg, but you will do that if they need the amputation to save their life. You will cause a harm in order to avoid a greater harm. In other words, nobody thinks we should take a needle and jab it into a baby. But if that baby needs a life-saving injection, you're going to cause that harm. You're going to poke the baby's going to cry, the baby's not going to understand it. Your intention is to minimize harm in the long run, in the big picture. So sometimes you can't avoid harm. Sometimes you actually have to create, in self-defense, for example. Somebody's attacking your house and your family. You don't really want to kill that person. You don't really know them, but you want to protect your family. So you ideally are going to exercise the minimal amount of restraint. And sometimes that even involves hurting the other person, the attacker. Sometimes it's a good thing for you to hurt another person because overall you're trying to minimize overall harm in the big picture. So that's why I think of it more like a compass rather than like an actual map. Where should we go? You have to decide where you're going to go, but the compass itself can tell you where you are.
Yes, well, indeed, I was going to say that. However, and that was exactly was going to be my point, that it is going to be a little bit dicey sometimes. It's not going to be a straightforward path into stairways to heaven, like Zeppelin once sang. Sometimes you're going to go a little bit sort of sideways or backwards, and as long as in the final analysis you yield, you're better off somehow. And sometimes you gotta, as you said, you're gonna have to inflict some harm. Self-defense is a prime example, but you're stopping a way worse harm by doing so. And you can choose to be wise. So a cop trying to stop a thief, they can shoot him between the eyes, or they can shoot him in the leg to stop the action. And this is where you have to exercise a little bit of wisdom as well to go with the kind of action you want to do in order to stop an aggression, but in a way that might not end the other person's life. So this is when it becomes a little bit complex, somewhat. But the general direction is there. In your book you've pointed out some cursors to morality from our evolution, that they actually way older than what we really think they are. But you've also mentioned that morality is situational. If you are Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway, probably morality will not be so much in play here. But when you are surrounded by people and you're sharing the same water spring, morality might become very relative. You want to tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, but first of all, just to wrap up what you said earlier, that principle sounds kind of neat and tidy, but often in the heat of the moment, I mean, if attacker's coming into your home, you're not going to sit down and make a list of pros and cons. You know what I mean? You're not going to have the time to rationally analyze. You're going to want to stop that threat. And often being who we are, we'll overreact. So I might actually kill that intruder and realize later, oh, I didn't have to do that. I could have shot him in the leg. You know what I mean? So you can't carry these principles with you like a big, manual book that you're trying to get through life. But to illustrate your second question here, let me tell you a little story. And I start the book with this story.
But sorry to interrupt, Dan, and that's why I didn't say a normal person instead of cop in my example.
Oh, a cop. Oh, yeah, okay,
and that way, because they're more trained for situations, they can anticipate situations like that. I'm with you. On a regular person like you and I, we're not trained to think like that.
Yeah, but I mean, we could, and we should, but how do you plan for something like that to happen? But often, though, it comes down to instinct. I think your title of your show is Intuitions. Where do we get our moral intuitions? But I would use the word instinct more or less synonymously. And the story I start the book with is something that really happened to me. I was in the Detroit airport. I was flying to New York City to be a guest on the Phil Donahue show to talk about life after death. And I had to change planes in Detroit. And so I'm waiting in this line. And back then in the late 80s, before 9/11 and before COVID, I mean, it was much more relaxed in the airports, and people could just walk up to the gate. So I was standing in line waiting to get into the gate on my flight to New York. And I don't know what I was thinking about. I wasn't paying much attention, but there was another line going to the next gate, which is really close. And there was a line of people there. And I must have noticed there was a young couple. They had a baby, and the baby was in this like little baby carrier thing. And they had put that baby carrier on top of their luggage on a cart, and it was, so the baby was about 3 or 4 feet off the ground, not too high. And the father must have walked away or something. I wasn't paying any attention at all, really, but the side of my vision, my peripheral vision, saw that baby kick, and that little carrier was rolling off the luggage. And then I saw myself reach across. I took a large step and reached across over, and my fingertips of my left hand caught that baby carrier as it was falling off. And then I reached over with my other hand, and I stopped the baby from falling to the hard floor. And so the mother, she grabbed it about a second later. She would have been too late. If I hadn't have done that, the whole baby, who knows what would have happened? I don't know. But I stood there holding this thing, and I felt this relief. I felt this emotion. I felt this heart pounding, and I felt like I'd saved my own child's life. You know what I mean? I felt this, maybe my palms, I don't know what was happening, but it was just like this instinctive, automatic, biological thing that happened. And I didn't even want to let go of the baby for a while. Of course, I had to give it back to the mother. Here's you can have. And you should have seen the way she looked at her husband too. But the question is, why did I do that? I didn't know those people. I might not have even liked them. They might have been Republicans. Who knows? Or they might have been, who knows? And I wasn't standing there in line thinking, how can I be a good moral person today? What are the principles of utilitarianism and harm principle? You know what I mean? I was probably thinking about what I was going to say on the show the next day. I wasn't thinking, how can I give glory to God or to Muhammad or to Joseph Smith? I wasn't thinking, how can I show the world that atheists are good people? None of that. What happened to me, and I'm sure it wasn't special. I'm sure things like that have happened in your life where you have reacted. You've just automatically did something that was like pre-rational or pre-moral. Some people would say it. You just did this thing. And why? Why would I do something like that? There was a risk involved. I might have hurt myself. I might have hurt other people. But why did I do that? You probably would have done the same thing. I'm sure you would have if you've seen that. So I think it's because we biological animals come prepackaged with instincts that we inherited from our ancestors. So if you think about it, our ancestors, or our potential ancestors who did not care about falling babies, were less likely to have their genes copied into the future than those who did. And that's evolution. Evolution weeds out what doesn't help because you're not going to reproduce. And so somewhere back in time, my ancestors were caring about protecting the young in some way. And there was this little, I guess, subconscious antenna in my mind that was noticing there's a baby and the baby's going to get hurt. Stop that, right? So I think a big part, it's not the whole thing, obviously. I would call it 1/3. 1/3 of our moral life comes down to what we might call instinct. And instinct can be very, very good. And as I just happened in that story, sometimes instinct can be not so good because those instincts evolved in an environment that no longer exists. We now live in a new environment. And some of those instincts that we had from 100,000 years ago, we still have them, but now we're living in cities and different larger groups. So the instincts may not be. Our tribal instincts, for example, were very useful way back when we were small tribal communities. We still have them. And sometimes we call it religion or politics, I guess. Anyway, I think we can see a precursor to our moral intuition in the part of our moral deliberations that we would call instinctive. And we all have that.
Indeed, I agree with you. Not every instinct is healthy. We know pareidolia, hyperactive agency detection, and things like xenophobia, which were pretty handy some stage of our evolution. It gives rise to maybe racism now. Not so handy. It's sort of it's an obstacle for us now. So not every instinct is sound, but in general, they played a very strong role, and they're very strong. One of the things I love about your book as well, that you've given a trinity of principles, and they're very kin to Sigmund Freud's the id, ego, and superego, but in a slightly different format. One of them, obviously, if the id is your instinct, that's got to be super strong. That's your glue. It's so difficult to get rid of. You gotta really work on it. Maybe tell us about the other two, if you don't mind, please, Dan.
Okay, so I use an analogy. And analogies are useful for illustration. Analogies are not really useful for argument, but they can help you to picture something, right? So don't take the analogy too far. But you've seen some of those old cartoons on TV where the person has an angel on one shoulder, and then they have a devil on the other shoulder, and then the person's going like this, back and forth. What should I do? Good or bad? What should I do? It's a dilemma. What can I do?
Actually, Dan, this very person you're talking about is right behind me. He's Homer Simpson. You can see him in the background.
Oh, yeah. Okay, there he is. All right.
Yeah.
So, and even Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. We have these demons in our nature and these angels. Here's what I want to do as a biological animal, but here's what I should do as a social animal. What should I do? Like if you're sitting in church or at a funeral or something, and you have this urge to burp out loud, you stop it. Why do you stop it? Why do you do that? Why don't you just burp out loud? Well, because it's not just you, it's a society that you live in, and you're sensitive to that. But in any event, you have these two things on both sides. So I think it's like a three model. On this side over here is instinct. And then over on this side is law. And in the middle is reason. The reason is the real time. Reason is your real brain in the moment, thinking, reasoning. And there's a verse in the Bible that says that the greatest of these is love. I think there's instinct, law, and reason, and the greatest is reason. And that these two individuals, this metaphor on your shoulder, they are like well-meaning friends that you will often not need to consult. You want to look at what your instinct is telling you, because sometimes your instinct is giving you the gut feeling that's right. Sometimes you don't even know, you haven't thought about it, but when something's going on in your life, you sometimes just instinctively know what to do. Often. Sometimes the instinct is wrong, but you want to consult this friend, as much as possible. Over here is law, and law is the result of not your own mind. Law is the result of the collective mind of the society that you live in. Instinct is the result of the minds of your ancestors. Your ancestors made decisions thousands of years ago, and those decisions that they made led to the propagation of led to you, basically. And so you inherited from them their minds. And over here, you live in a modern society that has laws. Hopefully, if you live in a humanistic, democratic society, you have good laws. Some countries have bad laws, right? I mean, a dictatorship, for example. So you should consult. And both of these minds on this side are like, they're the result of other minds that are prejudging. This is prejudging your action, and this is prejudging your action. Why do you drive the speed limit? Do you know? Why do I look at the speed limit when I'm driving? Because I could drive 100 miles an hour safely. I mean, we all think we could, couldn't we? We all think, well, yeah, I could, you could pretty much most of the time. But society, our country, our government has made laws for us that on average, over all drivers, over most of the time in most driving conditions, this is the safe speed limit for this particular road. And so I follow that. I don't have to stop and analyze, well, what are the road coefficients and what is the safety measures of this vehicle and what is the average speed of I don't think about all that stuff. I just take the law as a good prejudged guide to my action. Sometimes we should break the law. If I have a choking baby or a heart attack person in the back seat, I'm going to speed. I'm going to get to that hospital. I'm going to ignore the law. I'm drive as safely as possible, right? And then if I get a ticket, well, I'll pay the fine. I mean, because I'm trying to save this life, right? So law and instinct are friends that we should consult, and we should respect them, and we should take them into the moral calculation. But ultimately, in the middle, it's reason using what I just talked about earlier, reason using the harm principle. If you have time to think, if I had 10 minutes to think about catching that falling baby, I mean, that would have been, I still would have tried, but there would have been a way I would have come up with a moral justification. You know what I mean? I would have come up with some way to articulate it. In the moment, I couldn't. So if you have the time, you consult these well-meaning friends of yours that you sometimes ignore, because reason is telling you, well, there's going to be more harm or overall if I don't do this than if I do. So that's kind of my simplified, I guess you could call it the Homer Simpson model of morality, how we can get through life. If you have time, these are great guys. If you don't have time, instinct, and then usually you have enough time to think a little bit about how you can act in a way that results in the minimal amount of harm in the consequences of your actions.
So touching on the laws and making of laws, but we know some laws were horrendously wrong. Like, for example, I think at some point in the U.S. And elsewhere, there were some laws that sort of prohibit people from cross marriages, between blacks and whites, and homosexuality. I think what's his name now? Alan Turing. I think he was one of the many victims. A fantastic man who helped probably save millions of lives through the breaking of the codes in the Second World War, and the computers now, he's the grandfather of the computations processing powers of this current generation. So, but unfortunately, he had to take his own life because the way he was perceived, his acts were perceived at the time. So we know some laws are very flawed because they stem from the temporary knowledge of the people at the time, and it could be driven by agendas or biases. Even at the best of times, when people are really purely seeking knowledge and they want to be just and wonderful, they still are restricted by the amount of information and knowledge they have at the time. So it might still be a law good enough for a certain period, but we get to know a bit more later on. We're going to have to revisit the law and refine it a bit, which is fine. But then reason is waterproof, or it can also be flawed?
Well, reason is, for better or for worse, all we've got, really. It's not waterproof. And logic is actually works, but it works as long as your premises are right. You can have a bad premise and have good logic. You can have good conclusions that are actually bad, that are actually wrong because your premise is wrong. We all know that. Reason is broader than logic. Reason is Steven Pinker, in his new book Rationality, defines it as using knowledge to obtain a goal. Basically, we're trying to reach a certain goal. And who's going to tell you what your goal is? If your goal is minimizing harm, if that's what your goal is, then you're going to act in ways that do that. If your goal is to be the world leader like Putin, well, you're going to have different actions, right? So you got to pick your goals. But a lot of those laws that you talk about had their roots in religion, homophobia, and that come right out of the Bible. And are there any homophobic verses in the Quran? I don't know if there are, but at least in Islam,
not in the Quran, but in the Sirah and Hadith,
there are.
Obviously there is the punishment for in Islam is to actually push somebody from a high-rise building, and that's how you kill a homosexual person, not through stoning or beheading like in the other supposedly crimes in Islam, but actually you throw them out of a high building, which is a horrible way to die.
Well, so we've only had cities for about 6,000 years in our species. Our species is 100,000 or 200,000 years old. We've only had cities, which means we've only had high buildings for, maybe 5,000 years. So before that, there would be no way to punish homosexuality, would there? There were no high buildings. Maybe they would say a high cliff or something.
And believe it or not, Dan, the older religions, polytheism was actually quite inclusive when it comes to homosexuality. You know, the Greeks and even the Egyptians, that was completely acceptable. It's only when obviously the monotheism has arrived and is a new chief in town, this sort of thing has become a taboo.
Yeah. And you probably know about Robert Sapolsky. He's written a lot of good stuff. His book Behave is wonderful. And then he wrote a book called The Trouble with Testosterone, which I think is an amazing book. But he pointed out that the religions that originated in the desert tended to be more stark, more fierce, more hierarchical, more masculine, more warlike, in mistreating women and putting women down. A big alpha male father figure. The religions that originated in the jungle parts or the forested parts of the world tend to be more polytheistic and more inclusive and less of a top-down big daddy kind of religion. There's more, and I think that feeds into what you were just saying about how some of these polytheistic religions are more tolerant and not so upset about following every little tiny strict rule, which really was aimed at appeasing the authority of the whoever was in control, the king, the emperor, the master, the dictator, the plantation owner, or the military leader who was in control, or the husband. Husbands also had this top-down control. And I think, like in a lot of Native American societies, men and women were basically pretty much equal. They might have had a different division of labor, but as far as human beings, they were more equal than a lot of these desert religions. And look what we inherited in the United States and in Australia and in Egypt. We inherited the religions through Rome, but basically of the Middle East, of the desert religions.
Indeed. So the story of morality continues. I was just offline, was chatting to you about Patricia Churchland and her interpretation of morality and the way she's taken it way back to even before Homo sapiens have arrived on the planet. Well, not really arrived like literally, but evolving through the common ancestors. And the very first link of you've got your nervous system, or any creature's got a nervous system, and that nervous system is geared to protect the well-being and the function and the survival of that particular being that contains that nervous system. And you'll see that in reptilian and cold-blooded animals, that they have the offspring, usually hundreds of eggs, like in a water tortoise. And they don't care. There's no care factor about offsprings. They left to their own devices. They've got to learn very, very quickly, within seconds from being hatched, to make it to the ocean before all the birds of prey and other animals sort of started to eat them alive. They'll have to learn very, very quickly, but they don't learn too much throughout their life. And then to about 200 million years ago, the evolution from cold-blooded animals to hot-blooded animals and the open buffet, because you can now eat day and night because you're warm-blooded. You don't need, you can self-regulate your temperature through the burning of calories, your food, where you can eat day and night. But with that comes other complications that give rise to different type of breeding. You've got your offsprings. They're smaller in numbers, but they are so dependent on the mother, and they take longer time to learn the basics. But once they get there, their learning span is so much bigger. They can learn way more skills over a period of time. So this is the first time in evolution the personal nervous system has been remodeled to look after something other than the one that's contained within itself. It's a mother looking after herself and her offspring, which gave rise to morality, because this is the first time that you are looking after somebody other than yourself. What do you think of that as a precursor, like a very primitive kickstarter for the whole thing?
Yeah. But eventually you want your kids to leave the house. I mean, you raise them you raise them because you love them. I mean, you love your kids, obviously, and that's instinctive too. It's not like, oh, I'm going to choose to love this child. Well, it's your child, right? You love other children as well, but we have this instinct to protect our own. In Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, we really want to continue to protect our own genetic legacy. And since our children have more genetic commonality to us, we are more invested in them. But we also care about our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and by extension, every other human. We should basically. Um, so yeah, I think she's touching on something. But I think what Patricia is saying is that this is sort of a background or a precursor to morality. It's not like it's not like suddenly morality just came onto the scene. I mean, and some counterexamples would be birds. I mean, we see birds fiercely protecting their young while they're in the nest, before they go out on their own. We see many animals, many cold-blooded animals, and they have their own ways of thermal control. In fact, we get goosebumps. You ever wonder why you get goosebumps? I used to think it was evidence of God when I got goosebumps because I felt the spirit. But really, goosebumps are evidence of evolution because our ancestors had more hair, and the hair would raise when you were cold. That's for thermal control. Or it would raise when you're afraid, so you want to look bigger to scare off an attacker, right? So when do you get goosebumps? When you're cold, when you're scared, right? Or when something awe-inspiring weird happens, your hair raises. Well, there's no hair there. There's just those little bumps going up there, and that's a proof and evidence that we evolved from earlier ancestors that didn't have that. So I think she's right to show that across. I don't think it's just warm-blooded. The nurturing. Richard Dawkins. What book was it? I think it was the Unweaving the Rainbow. One of his books. He talks about how the need for human beings when we move from four-legged to two-legged, right? And as our brains got bigger, especially after fire, and we're able to cook our food, we were able to digest more quickly, get more calories. The human brain started getting bigger, so that caused a huge problem when the pelvis, when you're standing up, to deliver this huge head. So our species basically has to deliver the offspring much earlier than other species. Sometimes you see a deer born in the forest. It's born and then it jumps and runs off, right? It's like it's ready. It can go, and maybe the parents care or they don't. But with humans, we've lost a lot of months from other mammals, and so can you imagine just putting a brand new baby out in the middle of the forest and leaving it there? There's no way it would survive. It needs basically that first year, at least that first year of total devotion from the parents, or from the mother especially, hopefully from both parents, and from the clan and the tribe and the society we live in. It needs to be nurtured during that time, and that, I think, is playing into part of what Patricia was saying about the love we have, the love and the nurture that we have for our own offspring.
Yeah, indeed. In Australia, we've got all these marsupials as well. They're sort of born prematurely, and these bucket animals, and they need their parents' care for quite significant period of time. Elephants display that as well. Yeah, I agree. But Patricia is just showing you the very, very first part. But obviously, morality is taken to brand new levels, because you talked about kin selection and how just that caring for something else other than yourself is no longer just to the offspring. It's gone to the next of kin, your cousins, your tribe, your country, and I think, I argued it's the whole world at the moment. This is our next of kin is the world. It's humanity, and I'll include animals as well, all the species, all the living organisms. We're the guardians and the custodian of this miserable blue planet in the middle of nowhere, and we gotta look after everything, the ecosystem. It's a reciprocal altruism that everybody talks about. That you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The perfect balance of, we will do the right thing by each other. One of the questions that sort of came in the comments, that people were understanding that you're talking about these different elements, but they're still not very clear about your source. So here's a question that's saying, what is actually the source? Do you think the source then is therefore external, or is it just the situational source where we are the source of morality? We are our interactions, our brains.
Well, I don't think we even have to ask about a source. Does morality need a source? That might be one of those loaded questions. Like if I were to ask, if there's no God, who pops up the next Kleenex? Who did that? How did the Kleenex come up if there's no God, right? Well, that's a stupid question, but notice that in the asking of the question, I said, who? If you ask who, you're already begging the question, right? So a lot of times people are asking about what is the source of morality, as if there had to be this something out there, something that was causing the Kleenex to pop up. When I don't think morality or law has a source. I think it has ancestors, which is a different way of looking at it. If you look at law has ancestors. Law improves and evolves as time passes. Instincts improve and evolve as time passes. So if you want to say, I am the source of my own morality, you can say that, but it doesn't really mean much. I mean, you are who you are. I think the bigger question is, how do we justify our conclusions? That's better than what is the source of them, because a lot of religious people are still stuck in this mindset of there has to be absolute morality, requires an absolute lawgiver. Therefore, there's something out there transcendent under which we have to submit and get our marching orders from, right? There's that kind of thinking. And you don't have to even ask that question. You can look at how we evolved. You can look at how we act. You can look at our intentions, and we can, if you want to put a word on it, you can call that morality. But just because you have a word doesn't mean, well, that word needs a source, right? So I think if we can justify the reasons why we're acting in one way or another, if we can give a rational justification, then we're on solid ground. And I keep going back. I know others might disagree, but I keep going back to the simple harm principle. Some people have suggested that the harm principle amounts to utilitarianism. You know, Jeremy Bentham and other philosophers who talked about the greatest happiness for the greatest good. That should be our goal. I don't think it's that at all, because how in the world is my brain going to calculate the greatest happiness for the greatest good? How am I going to do that? There's 7-8 billion people on the planet. I think that might be a worthy job for a government or for an international organization to try to calculate that. But in our daily lives, we're not really living in a utilitarian way. Some have suggested that the harm principle is a kind of negative utilitarianism, like the least amount of harm for the most amount of people. But even then, how do you calculate that? We have to get through our lives right now. If you're a moral person, and you don't have to be, we might lock you up, but and you might not be mentally healthy either. You might be, a psychopath or sociopath, in which case we still might want to lock you up. But if you're a mentally healthy person and you want to get through life, you will be consciously thinking about how do my actions result in more or less harm than is necessary. And that's what it means to be moral.
I completely agree. Like, for example, taking an exam, you don't say, well, you passed an exam only when you get 100%. Most exams you pass at 50 or 60% if it's sort of higher level sort of exam, but you start with that minimal. Of course, you're going to get those excelling 5%, those between 95 and 100, and you treat those differently. But you start from the passing the exam point of view, and it's usually the 50 or the 60%, and this is where you start. You can build upon that, but you got to start there. If you start at, you can only pass this exam if you get 100%, then you're really setting yourself up for failure. So I completely agree with you. And one question for you here, Dan, do you think, we've talked about consciousness before, and I've talked about it with Dr. Richard Carrier, and it seems to be the consensus is there, even with Daniel Dennett, it's an emerging property. It's a property that comes as complications in the brain happen. The neo brain as well emerging, only 2 million years ago, when you have the prefrontal lobe cortex, and you've got empathy and sympathy in play, and you get suddenly that that emergent property. Do you think morality then also is an emerging property due to the complexity of human interactions, and that's why it disappears when one person on their own?
Yeah. Yeah, because obviously a tree doesn't have consciousness, and so there's something in a biological organism with a brain that's functioning, and you have to be alive. You can't. That doesn't apply to a dead body. A dead body wouldn't have consciousness. Obviously, that's what it means to be dead. So to say that something is an emergent property is not to say that it is a thing. A property is not a thing. And a lot of people think, well, consciousness, they give it a capital letter C. Consciousness is this thing. Oh, so where did it come from? How do you explain consciousness? I think a simple analogy would be water molecules. One water molecule is not wet. You need a huge collection of water molecules, and then there's this emergent property that we call wetness. If something's wet, well, what is wetness and where is it? It's not a thing anywhere. It doesn't actually exist in the individual particle. Look at a grain of sand. A grain of sand is pretty hard. You could scratch glass with a grain of sand, right? But if you have a huge collection of sand, the sand is soft. You can run in the sand in your bare feet. So where is the softness? Softness is an emergent property that comes from a collection that doesn't exist in any of the individuals. So I think Dennett and others are right to say that consciousness and even reason and morality are what you would call emergent properties of a large collection, complicated collection of functioning brain cells. So these things are functioning, and then they give this appearance of a thing that's not really a thing. Just like wetness is not really a thing, but it affects our lives. Obviously, you don't want to run across a wet floor. You tell your kids, don't run around the swimming pool. Why? Because it's an important property of the world we live in, but it's not a thing. So we don't need a source of wetness. We just need an explanation of it. And I think consciousness, I love Daniel Dennett's explanation of consciousness in his book, Consciousness Explained, where he calls it the narrative center of gravity, a narrative center of gravity. We've got all these different parts of our brain working at once. And even right now, your brain isn't just focusing on me. You're focusing, you're hearing your surroundings, and there's all these other things going on. You probably have a lot of background thoughts, and you've got lower level things happening that you're not even aware of. You might be watching for a falling baby in your peripheral vision. There's all this stuff going on in your brain right now. Dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of what some people call modules, which is probably a good analogy. They're all happening, right? And they're all kind of talking. And you even talk to yourself sometimes, right? And if you are alone on a desert island, you remember Tom Hanks in Castaway that you mentioned? He started talking to the volleyball. Wilson, and then when Wilson got lost, he was crying. Oh no, he was having a relationship with a volleyball, right? Our brains are doing these kind of things. So Dennett's center of narrative gravity is like there's all these parts of your brain right now, and there is no actual real consciousness. There's no little ghost in the machine. There's not some little controller who's making it all happen. He says it's just the sum total average center of gravity of all of that happening at once is what we call consciousness, which means that you're not only just aware of your surroundings, you're also aware of yourself being aware. It's a feedback loop. And Douglas Hofstadter, in his book, I Am a Strange Loop is the name of his book. It's a wonderful book, by the way. He wanted to call it I Is a Strange Loop. The concept of but his publisher said, no, nobody would buy a book. So he calls it I Am a Strange Loop, where it's a feedback mechanism where we suddenly are aware of ourselves being aware of ourselves. And that feedback then gives this illusion of a multi-dimension. We feel like, oh, wow, there's something more than just my body. There's something like in my brain that's above and beyond. And that's an emergent property. However you define it, it is something that only exists when the brain is functioning in a feedback loop, aware of itself.
Well, Of just folks, I put a link to Dan's book, Mere Morality, on Amazon. I've listened to it on Audible, and the reason I've chosen this version is because it's narrated by you. You've got one of the most serene voices, and I got a bonus song that it cannot be in a book. A wonderful song about reason. It was a nice surprise, and my wife actually caught me listening to the song. So, well, what music you're listening to? It's actually I'm listening to a book that has a song in it, and I didn't realize that you can actually sing that wonderfully, Dan. Because
that's nice about audiobooks, because in a real book you can mention the song, but in an audiobook you can actually play it.
Yes. Oh, it's a wonderful thing, and I was, it was I loved it. So people can have a look at Amazon, but if you got Audible, please get it on Audible, because with the narration and the way you narrate and you put the accent on certain areas and certain words, you read it differently. I've read the book or listened to it in the way it's meant to be read, because the way you emphasize a certain point in a certain word. It's a fantastic way to listen to a book, especially while you're driving a car and doing other bits and pieces. So it's a big thing for me. I'm loving it at the moment. One of the things that you talked about in your book, and it stuck with me, about especially dictatorial regimes, the glory, the word glory, any law that's written in the glory of something, it's usually it's a caveat for hiding some sort of a supreme or supremacy sort of agenda. It's not for out of a good reason or for a good purpose. It's for a nationalistic purpose or something. The only exception I'd make is the Glory of Love by Peter Cetera. It's a great song. But other than that, laws that made in the glory of usually sort of hide behind it, or betray some sort of agenda. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, the glory of a nation, right? And look at what nationalism has done, especially in our country, Christian nationalism right now. Like, our nation is the supreme, right? Look at Nazi Germany, or look at Napoleon, look at history. So the glory of a dictator, their face is plastered all over the place, right? In the United States of America, we base our country on rebelling against the glory. We fought against the king, the monarch, the sovereign, the dictator, the lord, the master. And instead of having this top-down monarchy kind of thing under which we are subjects, we flipped it upside down and said, nope, you know what's at the top? We the people. We the people. That was radical. That was new. And we even separated religion and government. And yet there's still a lot of Americans who want to go back to the glory days. They still want to go back to having a king. They treat the president like it's a king, right? Our president is just Mr. President or Mrs. President. It's not like your eminence or your highness, you know what I mean? Like in other countries. So glory usually is for the king and the master and the emperor. And a lot of times armies are marching for the glory of their emperor, of their master, which is just a guy. It's just a human being who is somehow, I don't understand it. I would never, ever want to be a king. I don't know why anybody would want to be a king. It'd be so draining and so dangerous. But there are some people in our planet who do want that. They're ambitious and they want to have the control over others. And they arrange it in such a way, like in North Korea, that everything is focused on them. And I can think of certain recent presidents too, who, might follow that mold. So yeah, glory. I'm writing a new book now called The End of Worship. And glory is a big part of it because, the Westminster Catechism asks, what is the chief end of man? It is to glorify God forever. And that's what in the Purpose-Driven Life, Rick Warren says in the Purpose-Driven Life, it's all about giving glory to God. So as soon as you have focused your life away from the compass of actual real morality, and turned it and focused it on this person, be it a transcendent God or a king or a dictator, you have surrendered morality. You're not moral anymore. You're at the service of somebody else's wishes rather than at the service of your own moral principles and moral intuitions.
And that's exactly one of the older dilemmas. Euthyphro talked about it. Other Greek philosophers talked about this dilemma, the divine command theory. Is it good because God says so, or God says so because it's good? And either way, it's flawed. If you're doing something because God says it's good, then you're not doing it because it's good. You're doing it because of an order. And we know how emotionally sort of confusing God could be, because he could actually, at a flip of a coin, he could change his mind and say something else, like kill the Amalekites and leave the virgins for yourself, and suddenly that sort of horrendous act become moral because it was ordered by God.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if God says something because it's actually intrinsically good, so what's the use for a God? Because then that goodness, the rule of goodness, supersedes the existence of God. It's good whether God is there to say it or not. So I've never understood God to be the source of morality. It doesn't work either way.
Well, there could be a use for it in a sense of maybe God is this wise parent who knows a lot more than we do, and so he's an educator. He knows what's right and wrong, not because he created it. Kind of like a normal parent. You have these little toddlers that need to be told, don't run out in the street. The little kid doesn't know why, but mom and dad know why, so they grab the kid and say, don't run out in the street. But mom and dad can give a reason. There's traffic out there, there's harm, and that's a moral act to minimize harm. So, theoretically, there could be some great emperor God who knows a lot more than we do, and we're just little toddlers. And that you sometimes hear preaching like that. We just have our limited brains. We are not the creators of the world, and we need this father figure to give us our moral guidance, even though he didn't create it, right? But eventually that little toddler grows up to be an adult and starts telling its own kids not to run in the street. Eventually we learn, eventually we grow, and these principles that may or may not be available to this big emperor, they're available to us too. We can learn it and we can figure them out as well. And by the way, I wanted to say, you touched on what I talk about in the second half of this book. The second half of the book is really a critique of biblical morality, like you were talking about the Amalekites. And I show that if you use the Bible as your source of morality, you're in deep, deep trouble. You have totally sacrificed any claim to being a moral person if you think the Bible is your guide. Yeah, there's 3 of the 10 commandments that are useful: killing, stealing, and perjury. Those 3 existed before the 10 commandments. I mean, they were human, and they were said even better. But the other 7 have nothing at all to do with how we treat each other as moral human beings. In fact, the first 4 are that glory of the dictator. Those first 4 commandments of the 10 are all about have no other gods before me. It's about the ego and some would say the megalomania of the Lord and the Master. So I show, I wouldn't have time to talk about all of it, but I went through and I looked at every instance in the Bible that used the word evil or wicked, because the Bible doesn't talk about morality. The Bible doesn't have ethics or morality. So how do we know what it is? If you look at evil and wicked, what the Bible calls evil and wicked, you could get a clue what the biblical writers understood to be good action and bad action. About 95% of the time in the Bible, the words evil and wicked, and they're synonyms for each other. They're often swapped for each other. Basically, the Hebrew word ra, about 95% of the time, they deal only with flattering the ego of the Lord. The big no-nos, the big things that are called evil and wicked in the Bible, the first one is idolatry. In other words, don't worship any other gods. That's a big one, and people were killed for that. The second one is the Sabbath. Most often, if you violate the Sabbath, you're called wicked. The third one is intermarriage. I'm surprised how much of the Bible deals with don't marry people from the other bad tribes because they're going to corrupt you. It's kind of like we want to keep the pure race and we don't want this outside influence. And then the fourth one is just general disobedience. But 95% of the time, those words have nothing to do with what you and I would consider moral, human to human moral interaction. There is about 5% of the times when the words evil and wicked are connected with things like drunkenness or gluttony or not helping the widow. I mean, once in a while you'll find that, and it would be surprising if you didn't.
Mm.
in a book written by so many people over so many centuries. So, and what a lot of Christians do is they cherry pick. Well, let's look at those things. This is what God meant, how to be good. But in general, the way to be good in the Bible has nothing to do with how you treat other beings. It has to do with how you treat God.
Yeah, I always thought about that, and I've critiqued the Ten Commandments myself. I find them. I mean, even when they're talked about not coveting your neighbors, and the word neighbor here means something. It's not just your neighbor, like your next door neighbor, but it's people of the faith. And the women are just right there with your with the donkey and the ass and the bull and the house, just as one of the possessions of man. And you're right. The very first few commandments have nothing to do with even killing. Moses was running away after killing that Egyptian. So somehow he knew what he was doing was wrong. And obviously the Egyptian law at the time would obviously punish for something like that. So the world knew about that thing was wrong before God sort of uttered the word. So like, duh, I mean, well, there is no new knowledge. What we wanted, something, slavery would have been a good one, because at that point we did not know. We thought it was a normal thing. At some point, even slaves themselves were bragging in the market to other slaves, saying, my boss or my owner is this person with this noble family. They almost like conditions themselves to be born into slavery, and they sort of accepted it. The world accepted it at some point. God would have been very good to come out here, and that would be a breaking news. That's new, a new knowledge to humanity. But it didn't happen.
Yeah, and slavery is part of the Ten Commandments. I mean, they're just, woven into the fabric. You should not covet your neighbor's slaves, it says, assuming that that's their property. But why didn't the Ten Commandments say that it's wrong to rape or that incest is wrong? I mean, there's all sorts of things that could have been said. And you often hear Christians say that, well, the Old Testament God was this, during that era, was a fierce war God. We needed that. But now that Jesus came, we have a gentle, warmer, friendly God, and that Jesus now changes everything. I used to preach that when I was a preacher. But I think Jesus missed a great opportunity. Like you say, if Jesus really were a moral reformer, first of all, he said, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He quoted all these Old Testament passages, the Hebrew passages, with approval of this murderous, genocidal God. He never once denounced him. If Jesus really was a true moral reformer, he should have got up and said, I apologize. I'm sorry. My dad was a jerk. He was horrible. What he did was bad. And now we're going to get rid of slavery. We're going to treat women with equality. We're going to honor the environment. We're not going to start killing and eating animals. I mean, that would have been amazing. That would have been a great opportunity. Instead, he was just a chip off the old block.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. There are a couple of parts that people sort of overlook where Mary, his mom, came to him and he sort of rejected her, said, you're not my true family. My true family is the faithful. And that poor fig tree, what did it ever do to Jesus? Got cursed for not having fruit out of season, which is very strange for an omniscient God not to know that.
Well, it was a way for him to prove how powerful he was. It was a way for him to show off. I'm a God. I can do this.
I always sort of stopped at that verse. It was really funny because it's completely out of character. The meek and mild, having some anger burst every now and then, and it was very strange. It's sort of akin to the Father at these points. So to wrap up the morality conversation, Dan, when we think about morality, it's not a thing, and therefore it does not really require a source, because it's not a fixed thing that is fixed with time. We know now it's situational. It changes over time. It changes based on knowledge and information coming in, reason, culture, timing. It's not a fixed thing. It cannot come from a source. It's changing with us. We're talking about the Tesla self-driven cars. And suddenly you're going to have some ethical and morality considerations about if this self-driven car is about to hit somebody, and you've got a young kid and an old man walking the streets, or a woman with a pram with a baby. Who do you hit? You got to hit someone. It's like the old train situation. Who do you kill? And suddenly we have moral situations that would not make sense whatsoever 200 years ago, but they're now, it's a reality. It's not science fiction anymore. So looking at morality that way would it make it stupid to talk about its source, because like you're asking what's the color of jealousy sort of question.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and at least the way I frame it, no matter how it changes or how it evolved or what its ancestors or our future descendants might be, there might be situations we can't even imagine. Like I'm sure the framers of the First Amendment and the Constitution, they weren't thinking about birth control or any of that, or unwanted pregnancies, and all sorts of ethical issues medical issues that we're dealing with right now. But as long as through all of that, you can at least have this principle, this goal of trying to end up with the least amount of harm, try to minimize all unnecessary harm, because there's got to be some harm in the world. But if that's your goal, if that's your plan, no matter what the situation or the future happens, you are acting as a moral person, I think. And that's the compass. It's not telling you where to go, but it's telling you how to think about where you want to go.
Finally, Dan, in all these debates you've gone throughout your life, and especially when you debate morality, there's always that question that sometimes started to make my blood boil at this point, that they ask you about what is your reference of morality. You're an atheist. Why don't you rape your mother or your sister? What stops you from doing that? I've got, as a religious person, the moral foundation that prohibits me from doing that. But you, as an atheist, what is your moral frame of reference? You've got none, and therefore you can be a Hitler in a heartbeat if it needs to be, because all what you're seeking is your benefit. What would you say to that again? Because I'm sure you've addressed it hundreds of times before, but what would you say to that argument?
Well, that argument is based on a pessimistic view of human nature. It assumes that all of us, without any moral restraint, are going to turn into these wild animals, killing and raping. I'll borrow what Matt Dillahunty has said. People accuse him of saying, well, if you don't have a God, you're going to go out and rape and kill and steal as much as you want to. And Matt said, you're right. I do rape and kill and steal as much as I want to. And as much as I want is zero. That's as much as I want. I mean, the Bible and other religious teaching assumes that there's something wrong with humanity. Just look at the headlines. Look at all the horrible things humans are doing. Well, yes, look at the headlines. They're headlines because they are unusual things. You never see a headline that says, a kid helped another kid crossing the street today at Thursday at 5 a.m. You don't see those. You only see the shocking, unusual things. And when you see a horrible headline, which supposedly proves how bad we are, right? What's the first thing you think? Maybe some mother did this horrible thing to her kids. The first thing I think is, wow, what an inhuman thing to do. We assume that what she did is not the human thing to do. We assume basically, and this is really true, that the human thing to do is caring and moral and kind and not harming. That's what we assume is normal. And that's why these abnormal things make the headlines. So let's not judge our species by what make it to the headlines. My goodness. Yeah, there are some people that are mentally ill or mentally unable to make moral decisions. There are psychopaths. 4% of the population is sociopathic right now, and which is weird. Most of them are not violent. But if you combine sociopathy or psychopathy with violence and extreme intelligence, you get one of these Hannibal Lecter type of horrible, you know what I mean, which are rare. They're so rare that we make movies about them.
Evil geniuses, yeah.
Yeah, so those people. A lot of them are not violent. They just become bank managers.
But that's the spanner in the works, Dan. These people we're talking about, they have a prefrontal cortex damage, so they're almost victim of their own actions. They don't have free will to start.
Well, they call it we all have an empathy circuit in our brains, and they've watched it, And in these people that are psychopathic, that link is broken. They don't have they can't identify with empathy with other people. So, and they think you and I have the problem. They think we are hindered from doing what we want because we have this thing called morality and empathy, right? They feel sorry for us that we're not able to get through life like they're able to get through life. Well, most of them end up in prison. But I was doing a debate, and exactly that question that you asked, my opponent, this happened more than once. My opponent has said, without God, there's no moral restraint. And the only source for morality is the command of God telling us what to do and what not to do. That's how we know how to be good or bad. And so I turned to my opponent and I asked him, if that's true, that good and bad is dependent on what God tells you, then if God told you to kill me right now, would you do it? And they're in front of an audience. Well, and one guy, Peter Payne was his name, he said, well, if I knew it was God telling me, then I would have to consider it, right? And another guy said the same thing. He says, well, if I was sure it was God, then yes, because God knows more than we do, and God knows that there must be a good reason for you needing to be killed. And so one person actually said, yes. Most of them hesitate. Most of them realize how uncomfortable the question is. And they say things like, well, God would never tell me that. And my question is, if God told you, would you kill me? And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable because it means they're surrendering.
We know from the scripture he's done it before to Abraham and Isaac or Ishmael. Take your pick if you're Muslim or Christian. So he's done it before, and it can happen again. We've talked. Remember that woman who drowned her babies because she heard voices in her head, and she would be well justified in her mind to do so. This is crazy, and this is the source of morality. I think Christopher Hitchens used to get very, very angry, and he used to give an analogy. I think there was a book by Guy Thorne, and a book was the turn of the century of the 20th century called When It Was Dark. I think they found the body of Jesus and the crown of thorn around him, and they realized this was Jesus and it was all fake. So they start fornicating on the streets and doing all these crazy stuff. And Christopher Hitchens used to get very angry. He says, because that is utterly not true. I'm not taking my morale. I do the right thing by my fellow species because I want this reciprocated. I want to live in an environment where my kids can go out and play on the street. I have the safety for myself. So I want to ensure others have it as well, so I can have it too. It's a great thing. I don't need any outside source to give me that environment that I wish to live within. So that always sort of struck me true in those sort of words. Dan, do you want to say any last comments with regards, especially your book? If there's any final ideas that can put this area to bed? Do you think it's ever going to be put to bed? I mean, all these arguments and all these comebacks from us, but you go back to, I guarantee you're going to go tomorrow to a debate, talk about morality, and you'll be faced with the same questions again as if they've never been addressed before.
Yeah, well, because I think it's information. You're right that morality does not need a source, but one thing it does need desperately is information. In order to make an informed decision about your actions, you need to know the likely consequences. You need to know. You can't just, oh, am I going to pick A or B? I just flip a coin. You need to know if this action of mine is going to result in more harm or less. What chemicals should we dump into the river? Is that going to hurt the environment or the people? There's all these questions that we don't know. Maybe this chemical is harmless and it'll be okay. If you don't know that, how are you going to make an informed moral decision? So yeah, there's no source of it. But if those of us who consider ourselves moral, and I think that's most of the species, we want a world with less violence and a world with more love and more understanding. We have a responsibility then, if we consider ourselves moral, to be as educated and as informed as possible as we can about the consequences of our actions. What about burning fossil fuels into the atmosphere? What about how we treat people in developing or in other countries? How do how do we weight all of these things in the grand scheme? That's often very difficult. The compass can be really simple. You have a simple compass, but the terrain that you're traversing can be extremely complicated. And maybe I have to go there, or maybe I don't. And if you're truly moral, you are open to new information. You're open to the idea, for example, that the Bible was wrong to say that homosexuality is an abomination. You're open to correcting past mistakes. You're open to adjusting, and you're open to saying, yeah, I've learned from that mistake. I'm going to do better next time. And, you know, even if we continue making mistakes and we muddle through life the best we can, if it truly is your intention to end up with a world with less overall harm, if that really is your intention, you're a moral person.
I completely agree. I think morality is simple. Navigating the terrain to get there can be a little bit complex. It reminds me of Frodo of Lord of the Rings trying to melt that evil ring, going to Mount Mordor to melt the ring. And it's straightforward. It's sitting there on the map. You can see it there. But to get there, you have to go through valleys and rivers and foes that are about to sort of attack you because they want the ring. So the terrain can be a bit dicey. It's something that you have to struggle with. But morality itself is not as complex as people make it to be. And I love the way you've reached a sort of a minimal ground that we can all share, we can all agree upon, and it doesn't take much effort to achieve. And it's quite achievable. And you can build from there. You can do better. You can get better at it and get to that extra sort of the 95 or 100%. But to pass the exam, you don't need to start with being completely altruistic, for example.
Yeah. Well, it's like if you learn how to drive, you get a driver's permit. That's kind of like a passing grade, because now that you got your driver's permit, you can start learning how to drive. And some of the attorneys that work for the Freedom from Religion Foundations got their law degree. They went to 3 years of law college. They said they didn't really start learning until they got on the job. Then they really started learning. So I think mere morality is the passing grade or the driver's permit or the law degree that then allows you to go out and start learning. By the way, Hanney, that Lord of the Rings story really didn't happen. It really didn't.
Well, Peter Jackson did a great job. It's sometimes better than the biblical stories themselves. They're quite believable. There's a big fan base out there in New Zealand, and they've got the Hobbits houses where you can go to, and it's a fantastic fantasy world.
Yeah, well, it's beautiful. Well, that's called art.
Yes. Look, Dan, I always enjoy the conversation with you. It's a conversation that I'll never get bored of. It's such an ease. The way you write your books as well. I think I've read every single one of them now. They are for everyone. Everyone can understand them. You have a talent of making complex or seem to be complex ideas very simple and easy to reach. And I'd like to thank you again for your time today.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. You are the real thing, Hanney.
Thanks very much. All right, folks. The final fifth part is going to be in a few weeks, and it's going to be addressing the final gap that God sort of resides within, which is death. What happens to us when we die? Thanks very much, and we'll see you later.